Hey everybody, welcome back to In Bed with the Millennial. I'm the Millennial, Javeda Bay, and this is my bed, and it is still Black History Month. So you know that I'm still gonna be talking about Black folks and sexuality and sex ed. So let's get into it. Today I want to talk about the silencing of pleasure for Black women, femme presenting, identifying folks, and why we really need to be talking about it. And if you're like, I don't even understand what that sentence means, Gervais, essentially, it goes back to last week's video. If you ain't watch it, go watch it. But you know how I talked about how a lot of the tropes in terms of like sexualizing Black bodies stem from slavery? Yeah. So also stemming from slavery is this like self-preservation technique, I guess you could say, in which Black women decided to stop talking about sexuality, to not have these tropes put on them, to like try and like distance themselves, like as a way to protect themselves from like being raped and things of that nature. And so in this historical practice of like, let's not talk about it, we don't want to be aligned with these things because then that means that people are more likely to harm us. It has done this thing, like most things from slavery, it has been passed through generations. So, in a self-preservation technique of like not talking about sexuality, to minimize instances of harm against Black women, femmes, and like femme presenting, identifying folks, it has then gone through the generations where talking about sexuality for Black women is not as common because historically we tried our best not to do it. And so now in today's day and age, like, yes, you're probably like, Jay, I see plenty of people talking about it. Yes, there's movement, there's change happening. But traditionally, historically, that's not the case. And if you're like, I don't know, I don't really know, I don't know if I really believe you about this, Gervais, you know that I have sources always. There's this great article by Evelyn Hammonds, which I read for school, also like how we got here. And it actually talked about this whole thing around the silencing of Black women in terms of sexuality and pretty much like overall, and how it was a safety precaution that then grew to be a thing that we just did and is like kind of like pushed sexuality to the outskirts, and with that pleasure to the outskirts for Black folks. And if you're like, Javay, okay, but give me more about this article. This is the article. You could go read it if you don't have like a library to access it through. You know you can email me and I will totally email it to you. I got a PDF. But it is essentially it talks about so much around like Black female sexuality. But the way that it's historically done is led to this place where like now it's like Black women not talking about sexuality has pushed Black women away from like talking about pleasure. Which then means that people that Black women are engaging in sexual activity with are also not talking about Black women's pleasure. And you see how this all like overlaps? And again, in last week's video, I gave another example of like how this like silencing around the conversation, and like the tropes and everything has longer effects in terms of like the example from Sharonda Brown's Refusing Compulsory Sexuality, which talks about how in the notion of like Black women are always supposed to be sexual, it erases like actual true identities of Black folks in terms of their sexuality and sexual orientation. So in the book by Sharonda Brown, it talks about how the notion that like all Black people are super sexual and they all love sex and want to have sex, it erases Black asexual folks. So if you're thinking in terms of like silence around talking about sexuality and how that impacts pleasure, like how then are we talking about the way Black women experience and want to experience pleasure? We're not. Also, we know this for a fact because also that whole pleasure gap thing, yeah, it's real. So it's just like a multi-layered thing. There's so many different components that go into this. But the silence as a form of self-preservation has been trickled down to now be something that is kind of standing in the way of Black women in experiencing pleasure in all the ways that they want to, not just like in one specific type of way. Okay, Javay, but like, why exactly would anyone want to like silence themselves and not talk about sexuality? The trope of the Jezebel is the biggest reason, because if you talked about sexuality in any way that could make you seem like, oh, you are a little like slut, a little hoe, this is like before these words were reclaimed to be good things, then it gave justification like, oh, well, that's just what Black women do. Black women are Jezebels. They're just out here trying to sleep with everybody. They're home wreckers, all these things. And then led to the justification of, well, she's a Black woman. It's not sexual assault. It's not the R word. It's not those things. So that's why it's important to talk about it. Like, that's why it's important to understand like how the silencing came to be is like from that harmful trope. But the harm that they tried to prevent has now led to like this erasure of pleasure. Okay, Javay, but like, how has it led to this erasure of pleasure? Well, one, the talking about sex aspect. Talking to a lot of Black women, especially older Black women, the conversation of like sex was not commonplace. Like talking about like sex in general, not commonplace. Like you didn't talk about it. It was like super quiet behind closed doors. Even like instances of like being like, no, I don't do those specific sexual activities because that's going to make me look this type of way. Even if somebody would have enjoyed those sexual activities. A great example is if you talk to different generations of Black women about blowjobs. There are some very differing opinions. Like some are like, I could never do that. And a lot of it's rooted in the idea of like, then I'd be seen this specific type of way. And not even around like, I don't enjoy the activity, but like, I could never do that because then this gets attached to me, and the this that gets attached to me stems from like the Jezebel trope. And then if you talk to like more recent generations, they out here being throat goats. So like it's obviously like there has been a shift, but a lot of it is so deeply rooted that if you just go back and like talk to different generations, you'll see where these things pop up. But also in this silencing, it leads to like the lack of like discussion of pleasure. Like sure, if you get to a point where you talk about sex with somebody, how often is the conversation actually around like, oh, you know what, this is what I enjoy, this is what I like. Especially in the sense of like we know that the pleasure gap exists for women and folks with vulvas because like, you know, it has not been prioritized in terms of them experiencing pleasure. And so when you think about it for Black women, like them not talking about it then also makes it harder for them themselves to be like, oh, this is what I enjoy. I don't feel comfortable naming these things because I've been told not to talk about these things. Are you seeing the connections here? The big moral of the story is that everyone and their mama needs to be talking about sex. But especially Black women need to be talking about sex and moving away from this notion that silence is going to protect us in terms of not being like aligned with tropes and stereotypes. We can exist in all of our complex ways and facets and parts of us, and talk about who we are as sexual beings in terms of pleasure, and still push back on all these negative tropes and stereotypes that people are putting on us. And so if you are not a Black woman watching this, I want you to do your part and not further perpetuate stereotypes and tropes in terms of sexuality and Black women and sexualizing Black bodies. And I also want you to do your due diligence and like actually check it in and be like, yo, let's talk about your pleasure, because I don't think we do that enough, you know? But it is super real. And in terms of for Black women, it's like a really tricky terrain. Like it's really difficult. Like how do you navigate this when you also add in the layers of like, you know, wanting to have a job and like be like a adult in like the workspace? Like for us, sexualization impacts on so many different levels. Like I, in this Black body that can be sexualized by in so many different ways, showing up in the same type of work attire as somebody else can instantly be looked at as like, oh my gosh, well, you're just like, wow, you're really like trying to like catch people's eyes and things of that nature. So like understanding the sexualization of Black bodies and then all of the different things that have stemmed from that, from slavery, is so important. So important. So yeah, just make sure you as a Black individual are prioritizing talking about sex and pleasure for yourself, not for others, but for yourself. And if you're not a Black person, make sure you ain't letting people out here perpetuate stereotypes on people and push them onto folks. We don't do that. It's 2023. No better. But yeah, make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel, because if you're not, it's Black History Month. And definitely make sure you're following me on all the social media platforms, because you know I got content for days on all of them. And definitely make sure you subscribe to my email newsletter, because that's where the goods are. And if you haven't already, make sure you are signed up for Thursday's workshop, all about the hands, where I give you digital and manual skills for pleasure. But yeah, until next time, I'm gonna see you later. Deuces.